So I released a new song yesterday, and it might be worth listening to before you watch this because it is unexpectedly relevant. I stopped introducing myself by name around 4 months into this YouTube channel's life. At first it was whatever. Hello, welcome, my name is kubas-meyer, blah blah blah. But that quickly wore out its welcome. And starting with my second video of 2019, I decided to give myself some sort of descriptor instead. Often a little jokey, maybe a bit self-aware. The Good Place revealed me to be a liberal arts major. Dear Evan Hansen, a total downer. Dance Gavin Dance, the kind of guy who sits during metal shows. And on and on. At the time, I was still saying my name is, but eventually that shifted to the more grammatically coherent you can call me. And when I got my new channel identity branding thing, I made sure the little graphic I used reflected that as well. Most of the time, I don't know what I will tell you to call me until the end of the writing process. I'm not sure how I want to contextualize myself into the story I'm telling you until I know exactly what the story is. And sometimes not even then. I put a placeholder in the script, 3 capital X's in a bracket, and hope that I remember to fill it in. I haven't missed in a while, but there have been times when I was in the middle of shooting, reached that point in the script, and saw those X's were still in that bracket. It was not fun to realize that I would have to scrap everything I'd just done and still figure out who the fuck I was supposed to be that week. Which means by now, I have come up with more than 100 different ways of defining myself. And here's to infinity more, right? But also, Jesus Christ, every time I want to tell people how I feel about a movie or whatever, I need to describe myself in a completely new way. What a bad idea. And yet, here we are. I will probably need a spreadsheet soon to make sure I'm not repeating myself while always digging deeper and getting weirder to make sure that I keep giving you things that are new, but true. And I think it's important, even if it was not intentional, that I switched perspectives when I changed the intro from the first person, my name is, to second person, you can call me. I could have gone with I am. That would also work grammatically, but it wouldn't feel right. Because I'm not reducing myself for me, I'm doing it for you. You don't really know me. Even if you've watched every one of the now 142 videos on this channel, come to all 20 of the live streams I have done since the COVID quarantines began, you've got no idea what it's like to just sit in a room with me, let alone anything deeper. You have seen a lot of different sides, but you can never see the whole thing. But you've inevitably made assumptions, formed your own feelings about who and what I am. Maybe you think of me as actually interesting, or possibly a total weirdo, complete narcissist, needlessly political, not political enough, not political in exactly the way you are, and so incorrectly political. Perhaps a swell human being. Probably not the last one, but likely one of the former, or maybe you don't even get that far and think the only one of these I would actually bristle at. YouTuber. Because whatever else I am, I'm not that. When I first heard the name DelGaudio, he was still a magician, one who had this cool show playing in the city that a friend told me I had to see. This was 2017, and he had a serious list of accomplishments. The Academy of Magical Arts Close-Up Magician of the Year in 2011 and 2012, and Overall Magician of the Year in 2016, an assistant to Ricky Jay, and a consultant on The Prestige, among many other things. But he has been pushing back against that title since long before then. In a video announcing him as a speaker at the 2017 Future of Storytelling Summit, he explained how the meaning of the word magician has changed over the years, and how it has created a sort of expectation in the audience that his work is never going to meet. Yes, he can do magic and illusions and tricks that are among the most incredible you have ever seen, but that's not the point. And now that he's had this cool show that everyone loves, he has been able to change his own narrative. Wikipedia calls him an interdisciplinary artist, primarily known as a writer, performer, and magician, putting the one thing I thought I knew last in the order. On Twitter, he calls himself an unreliable narrator, which is a little cutesy, but also not wrong. It's in keeping with his past work and also his future work, if the book he's got coming out in a few weeks is any indication. I'm genuinely excited about that too, both because I've been trying to read more and because it's from the guy who made the best thing I saw in 2017. Plus, the name, Amarelman. He's so mysterious. That was a joke, but I'm not really joking. Anyways, it turned out that cool was a monumental underselling of what DelGaudio was doing in that little theater by Union Square. And if the Week I Review had existed back then, it would have been the first 10 out of 10 on the leaderboard instead of the second. And I guess I've spoiled the ending of this video for you, but frankly, if you were just here for the score, your priorities are kind of out of whack. Though also, if you were here for some sort of deep breakdown of DelGaudio's performance or a meticulous comparison of the staged performance versus the taped version that Hulu released last month that I am ostensibly but not necessarily reviewing here, then this is clearly your first time on the channel. Welcome! I will be doing a bit of each, but this video is neither of those things. Part of the reason that this has been the longest writing process of any video on this channel by a fairly healthy margin is because I wasn't sure who exactly it was for. Folks who already saw the show and/or film, haven't but want to, haven't and never will, but are curious what the experience was like. Frankly, if you're in that middle category, just stop this and go watch it. Seriously, YouTube will get mad at me for the low watch time percentage, but your life will be much better served by spending 90 minutes with Derek DelGaudio than however many with me. But those two other camps, they're more interesting because I don't need to beat around the bush for either, though the latter requires some explanation that the former doesn't. And I kind of tried to split the difference. So it is probable that exactly no one will be happy, but you can take solace in the fact that as long as this is, it could easily have been so much longer. I really wanted to keep this under an hour, and 9,000 words seemed like it's cutting that line real heckin' close already. In any case, I ultimately decided to not make this video with anyone in mind other than myself, which means that even more than usual, it's got a whole lot of me in it. Though the chapter markers on the play bar will do their best to demarcate show-centric versus me-centric sections. But that's how it has to be. It is impossible to meaningfully discuss in and of itself without talking about yourself, because it is a performance about identity, about how other people see you, how you see yourself, and how those two things are deeply, though perhaps not inextricably linked. And you are asked to define yourself the moment you step into the venue. That's not a metaphor. The first thing you see is a giant wall of cards, 9 high and dozens long. When the show was initially performed in LA, there were 690 cards. In New York, well over 1,000. Each says in bold block letters, "I am." And then below a tearaway fold is a label. And they sure do run the gamut. You got everything from drama queen to marine biologist to videographer to ninja to the letter G. Some are inevitably funny, like cunning linguist, while others can become funny with context. A slight person selecting heavyweight, or a old white man in a sweater vest claiming trendsetter. There are others like failure and nobody that few would like to admit to themselves. And then there are those that even fewer are likely to admit to others, such as racist. And you don't know, while you're choosing, how that information is going to be used, whether other people will actually see what you have selected for yourself or if it's just for you. And you cannot even imagine that when it is revealed, if you give it the chance to be, how it will be done. You don't keep the label, though. It must be surrendered to get your playbill. Well, you can hold onto the I am, which unfortunately I've lost in the past 4 years. DelGaudio gets the full set of descriptors, divorced from the people who selected them, of course. This stack will be used periodically to involve members of the audience, each anonymously brought into the performance by what they had chosen for themselves. DelGaudio has one too. The first thing he does is tear his own card and put it down on top. And he never actually introduces himself, meaning no names are spoken during the show. And it makes sense. I mean, part of the reason I stopped introducing myself in the traditional way is because who cares that my name is Alec? It doesn't tell you anything about me. And what you learn from knowing my last name is kubas-meyer is kind of abstract and only useful once. Yes, I am willing to put my actual legal name out there while knowing that my actual legal name is incredibly specific, and there is almost definitely no one else on Earth with it. In a world where so many people hide behind digital avatars or stage names or whatever, that's not nothing. But the fact that I'm not using a screen or stage name means that there's little to be gleaned from what I call myself, a name given to me by folks who knew nothing about me other than the color of my skin and my assigned sex, because that's all there was to know. And yeah, there's some evidence that names shape personalities, and of course we have a growing contingent of folks choosing their own names these days. But even if a name means something, that meaning is hidden beneath an ogre's worth of layers. At face value, it's just a name. Nicknames are similar. Oftentimes they are a function of convenience. Someone's name is too long or too common, and so people simplify or signify it in some way. Alec is neither of those things, so I never expected to get a nickname. I did, though. I became V as I headed into high school, and there is a reason that it happened, but it also didn't mean anything. I had just shown up to the local theater summer camp and performed my first ever audition monologue, Hugo Weaving's alliterative entrance in V for Vendetta. In view, a humble vaudevillian veteran cast vicariously as both victim and villain by the vicissitudes of fate. This visage, no mere veneer of vanity, is a vestige of the vox populi now vacant, fetish. However, this valorous visitation of bygone vexation stands vivified and is vowed to vanquish the virulent vermin, vanguarding vice and both chafing the violently vicious and voracious violation of volition. The only verdict is vengeance. A vendetta, hell's a votive not in vain for the valiant veracity of such a one day vindicate the vigilant and the virtuous. Something, vox populi, verily this vicious swallows of verbiage veers most verbose. You can call me V. Nailed it. And the same group of kids who had turned my then best friend Zach into Zeus asked if I would become V. And why would I say no? That is a terrible first impression to have with all these cool older kids. And also, this was 2006, mere months after the movie hit theaters and several years before the hacker group Anonymous would co-opt its iconic Guy Fawkes mask. Obviously, the character has its own connotations, but in that moment, they didn't really mean much. Very few people thought I was actually going to blow up a building. And when I was asked by local law enforcement in my junior year if I had plans for that, my nickname wasn't used as evidence against me, just a series of half-remembered AAM conversations someone claimed to have had with me 5 years earlier. So that was fun. But because V had no deep personal meaning for me, and also because that co-opting had eventually taken place, I dropped it as I entered college, meaning it is isolated to a very specific time in my life. I didn't push people all that hard to use it. I asked teachers to call me V because I wanted to be able to just put one letter at the top of written assignments instead of my annoyingly long last name. But once I made the request, I used the letter and didn't really care what they called me. Most kids that I knew from before then called me Alex, so most people still thought of me that way. But the folks I actually spent all of my time with called me V, and every so often, someone from back then will still do that on Facebook or whatever. And there's something kind of fun about that. I didn't get a real nickname in college, though there was one person with whom I became probably too fast friends before we became something resembling enemies, who gave me descriptors. Maybe the sorts that would be on one of DelGaudio's white cards, but really more like what would be on Cards Against Humanity's. It started pretty straightforward. I was a bossy little bitch. Then a friend of hers confided that he found me distractingly handsome, and that became number 2. Impeccable timing was next, because prior to about 11 months ago, I was always early or exactly on time to things. I still try, but it's less of a personality trait than it once was. My impeccable timing meant that I arrived at the Daryl Roth Theater early enough to have pretty much full pick of the cards. Not that you're ever left wanting for choice. As I said, there were more than 1,000 available to just 150 audience members at each performance, so only a small fraction go any given night. But there are ones that will always be selected, and it is first come, first served. And so I looked through what was there, trying to find something that I felt reflected me, who I am, and possibly who I want to be. But what never occurred to me was that maybe I should leave something meaningful for someone more deserving. Film crit Hulk, who is easily one of my favorite media critics and someone I personally support on Patreon, the same way you could support me if you wanted. He wrote an incredibly moving essay about this show that is very different from and frankly more meaningful than what I am doing here, and you should read that one after this so that you're comparing me in retrospect instead of at the time. Hulk devotes a lot of space to the existential crisis that he faced when looking at that wall, and specifically how he decided not to be a writer, even though that is what he is, because it seemed possible to him that a famous author or screenwriter or whatever could come in, and how dare he steal the opportunity to have that title from them. So he chose a label that other people had given him his whole life, and that's pretty bleak. It never occurred to me that someone more objectively significant could come to the show and make me feel like I'd robbed them of their label. And I don't mean that in a self-important way. I mean that I just never thought that anyone in the audience would be quote-unquote famous and therefore more worthy of any given title than the rest of us plebs. And indeed, there weren't any visibly famous people in my audience the way that there seemed to have been at many other shows. But even if I had thought about that, it wouldn't have changed anything. Of course, I'm not the person most deserving of any of those cards, not even fucking close. But if I'm the guy who got there first, getting to be who I want to be seems like a fair trade-off for my having to sit and stare at the admittedly very cool stage for an extra 30 minutes. It didn't work out like that because they didn't have the card I wanted at all, and so I had to choose something different that I doubt I would have had any competition for, but we'll talk about both of those later. I was surprised and more than a little concerned when I heard that Hulu was going to be hosting a filmed version of this show, fully titled DelGaudio's in and of itself, because it seemed like the very act of recording it actively undermined the message. Early in the performance, DelGaudio looks out into the audience and asks for a volunteer. He needs someone to come back tomorrow. And the selection of Mr. Tomorrow sets up what he says is the scariest moment of the show, when he asks aloud if Miss Yesterday is in the audience. And they always are, but they could always not be. There are any number of things that can go wrong during a performance, and particularly a performance like the one DelGaudio is putting on, but all of those are at least somewhat within his control. The only thing he truly has no power over is whether that random volunteer will actually come back. I deeply wanted to be Mr. Tomorrow, even before I knew what that meant. But the next night, a childhood friend who lives in LA was doing a New York show with his very good band, The Rare Occasions, and I wanted to see them. And sure, raising my hand wouldn't guarantee my selection, but I decided in that moment that being there for Brian was more important than being here for DelGaudio again. Was it the right decision? Hard to say, but it was the one I made. And so it was someone else. Mix Tomorrow has a homework assignment. They're given a book, which is more like a tome by the time I saw it, so full of stuff that it looked ready to burst. This book is inspired by an old-timey ship's log used at sea to track the voyage as best as it can. When the sky is clear, the log is flawless. In a torrential downpour, there's going to be some guesswork involved. Mix Tomorrow will be doing both, since they are asked at a critical juncture to leave the theater. And before they return to become Mix Yesterday, they must write what they have seen and also what they expect to see. They must imagine how the show will end, write that down, and then they will read it out loud to the next audience. And so the book develops over the many, many months of performances to become a record of what in and of itself is both literally and metaphorically. Some of what's in the book is definitely true, while much of it is conjecture. And this combination of fact and fiction is precisely what the show is about. No individual entry can come close to fully capturing the experience. But with each new piece of information, we get closer. By the final entry, we know enough about how we got there. But the critical difference between it and its inspiration is that the people writing in DelGaudio's book never know the destination. There is always something missing, a piece that the writer fills in with their own thoughts and projections. But now there's a film. That's kind of weird, right? There is a set record of this event that was only ever supposed to live in our memories and in that book. There is now a single permanent impression of what was done, and anyone who sees Derek DelGaudio's In and of Itself on Hulu instead of In and of Itself in the theater will be getting the exact same imagery in the exact same way. What they take from it will remain intensely personal, but a dynamic performance has been rendered static. There is a famous and understandably oft-quoted line from Jean-Luc Godard's 1960 film Le Petit Soldat. To photograph a face is to photograph the soul behind it. Photography is the truth, and the cinema is the truth 24 times a second. It's one of those statements that feels profound, though I don't know if it actually is. I mean, photography is often used to obscure at least as much as it reveals. But nonetheless, it feels like the kind of line that DelGaudio has had long conversations about with either himself or his probably very interesting and smart friends, because how to present the truth is one of the key concepts in these narratives that he's making. I mean, look at the subtitle of that book he's got coming out, A True Story and Other Lies. Dude's not being subtle. That said, In and of Itself was subtler than Derek DelGaudio's In and of Itself is. There's voiceover now at the beginning that essentially tells you what the show is going to be about while audience members are selecting their cards. And this voice comes back to say things that guide the audience along with the ideas that the show is grappling with, but were not said to people in the room. It is a little odd. Something that seems there to fill space because an audience at home, I guess, can't be as captivated by what's happening as the audience there could be. It feels ever so slightly condescending. You know, like, I'm not going to say that this is the equivalent of Deckard's VO added to Blade Runner by the studio, but I'm not going to say it. One of the newly added comments stuck with me, though. I do not expect you to believe anything you're seeing or hearing, and knowing you won't believe me, that's the only reason I'm going to tell you the truth. Only one man knows how much of what Derek DelGaudio says in his performance is literally true, and obviously he's not going to tell us. He acknowledges in that same voiceover that what he is doing appears as a performance, with an audience and stage, and a man whose lines and actions are rehearsed. It is easy to lie on stage, and even easier on film. But if we get hung up on all of that, we're missing the point. I spent a long time thinking about this, how storytellers use lies to tell the truth. I began conceptualizing abstract examples I could use before remembering that I have literally done that myself. And not only that, but I had done so on a tiny stage for a handful of people just a few weeks before I sat in the Darryl Roth Theater and saw DelGaudio doing it. Now, longtime viewers will likely recognize this picture, the only image I have from a one-man performance piece that I did back in 2016, and which I like to bring up just so that I can use the picture. But I rarely mention the follow-up I did a year later, in large part because there are no images at all, and if I'm going to bring it up, then I really need to talk about it. So let's talk about it. In 2017, Derek DelGaudio told Stephen Colbert that he sees in and of itself as something of a theatrical existential crisis. Colbert was so moved by the show that he and his wife would go on to make the film happen, functioning as its executive producers. And my shows were something like that. The first was a half-jokingly called Nobody's Idea of a Good Time, and it consisted entirely of me sitting on a stool and listening to a second-person recording I had made 6 months prior but never listened to, wherein I detailed my relationships with women throughout my life in embarrassing but not excruciating detail. And that's it. That was the show. Bringing the picture back in, obviously I am not wearing anything but underwear and a blindfold. You may have also noticed my buzzed head, but probably not the hair all over the stage. This image is what people saw when they came into the little room 2 avenues west of Times Square that I had rented for an afternoon. Over its shitty speakers, they listened to my publicly available pre-show playlist, which began as soon as the house opened and intentionally went 9 minutes past the hour to give anyone who got unlucky with public transit the chance to get there before we actually shut the doors. No chairs were set up. When each person came in, they were asked to grab one of the foldables placed along the back wall and sit wherever they wanted. I was already turned away from them, so the blindfold wasn't strictly necessary, but it was certainly a lot more dramatic when I turned around and took it off once the playlist ended. You know, the reveal of my freshly buzzed head and shaven face at the same moment that I saw who was in this thing with me. I did all that going from this to this because I didn't want anything that I could hide behind. They would see the full, raw reaction for the next 90 minutes as we listened to me from 6 months prior berating me in that moment. It was a lot and seemed like a bad idea even at the time, hence the name, but it turned out to actually be kind of cathartic. I got out a lot of stuff that I felt like I'd needed to get out from a time when my life had been falling apart. And other than the fact that I actually cut my hair at home and brought it to the venue, everything about the performance was honest. The stories were true, and so was my reaction to them. Not so a year later. Nobody Thought This Needed a Sequel was similar in concept, but much more theatrical, dramatic, and frankly, interesting. Also, the pre-show playlist, way better. Instead of a recording, this second-person script from 6 months prior was being cold read live by someone sitting about 5 feet to my right. And so there I sat, taking it, in front of an audience of 5. I had put up a casting call explaining what I would need and acknowledging the pretension and narcissism involved. Numerous applicants sent in messages noting its similarity to the work of Nassim Soleimanpour, which I wouldn't experience firsthand until about a year later, and I totally get why they said that. One of the girls I ended up auditioning I had matched with on Tinder the year before and briefly chatted with but never met. She did not recognize me. That's the sort of thing I would have mentioned in the script had I still been writing it at the time. The lie that my sequel was built upon was that I had given the reader agency to comment on the story she was reading, when in reality, each of her asides had been pre-written for maximum psychological damage. She told the audience that she could go off script, but only we knew that when she skipped literally 2 printed pages claiming that she was done with my bullshit, that those pages said nothing but lorem ipsum. The story she cut off never ended, and what she seemed to come into partway never actually began. But only I knew that it was going to happen beforehand. And that's the drama, because we both had to sell it, her the frustration that would make her skip these empty pages, and me the shock that she had done so. It was actually pretty great. Too bad you missed it, huh? By having the reader lie about this, I ensured that I could tell this story of my life while also commenting on it honestly. The fact that I put that snark into someone else's mouth was important because I really did understand how ridiculous the whole thing was and felt I had to acknowledge it. They say we are our own strongest critics, and this was a literal manifestation of that. But it's also not the only way I lied to tell the truth. I straight up fabricated 3 of the several dozen stories put into that script, and the reader told the audience that was the case. And with that in mind, I was able to tell 3 stories that were very true, that I had not felt comfortable putting into the script a year before. In reality, most people knew which were which. But in order to feel okay revealing what was true, it needed to be possible that it was false. In and of itself begins with a story about a story about a story about a story about a man called the roulettista, which just means the guy who does roulette, in this case the Russian variant. DelGaudio was in a small bar in Spain, and some random person told him the story of this man, and when DelGaudio asked why, he is told that it is because he is the roulettista. And we will spend the rest of the show learning what that means. The 6 chambers of a revolver are represented in the set, 5 objects he will interact with over the course of the performance, and then a mechanical representation of the man who put a gun to his head night after night and always beat the odds. With each of these simple objects, DelGaudio will tell a story that helps us understand who he is, and then he will blow our fucking minds with a piece of magic that ranges from, I think I sort of understand what he did, but who cares, it was amazing, to literally a miracle. And because so long goes in between each of these, you sometimes forget that this guy is an award-winning magician because, again, that's not what he wants you to think of him as, because he's not here to fool you. The magic in this show is here to make you understand his world and see something in a different way, either metaphorically or very literally. But at least some of the incredible impact that these moments had were a direct result of the fact that they happened in front of me. When he did the first piece of magic involving a paper boat and a bottle half filled with liquid, I saw something. I was seated a little off to the side, and in his sleeve there was movement that I still don't understand, but know I wasn't meant to see. I wasn't looking for seams, but one had shown itself. I never saw another, and you will never even see the one because you can no longer be in that audience and look anywhere you like. DelGaudio is a master of direction and misdirection, making sure your eyes are in the place they need to be so that his reveals have their maximum impact. But now, your eyes are no longer being directed just by DelGaudio, but also by actor-filmmaker-puppeteer Frank Oz, who helmed both the stage show and the film. We see the show through movements and images that he composed because he felt that the best way to see it, at least outside of the original theatrical setting, was in this way. But it's more than that, because I didn't tell you the whole quote from Le Petit Soldat, and it reflects something else DelGaudio said there. Sure, cinema is truth 24 times per second, but every edit is a lie. And it's true, I'm about to lie to you myself. When I started doing these videos, I was doing them all in a single take. I would look straight into this camera for 9 to 13 minutes, and if I made a mistake or my microphone fell into frame or whatever with 30 seconds to go, too fucking bad. It was the unfortunate and inevitable consequence of my commitment to this style without jump cuts, because I want this story that you're hearing to happen at a pace that I set now, in this room as I am filming, rather than later, in the same room when I'm editing. My apartment is very small. But when I began implementing asides, like the one I just did, it became ever so slightly easier because when I messed up, I could just go back to the last head turn. It was a fortunate consequence of my deep belief that my extraneous thoughts deserve a place in these videos just as much as the pertinent details. I wasn't doing it to give myself an out, but at the same time, I literally couldn't do this video in a single take because we're probably around the 30-minute mark here, and when that file hit 29:59:59, my camera stopped recording, and I had to get up and start it over again. But you didn't see that. When it happened, I just went back to my last aside and started that section over as though nothing happened. There were 1,035 words between what I said about my sequel having a better Spotify playlist and the size of this apartment. I don't know how many minutes that was, but I'll be sure to put it on screen, as well as how many times I had to redo it. It is a lot to redo, even if it isn't the entire script. Originally, the gap was a mere 700 words, then it was 1,400, and then it went back down a bit. As I expand and contract the story, my little checkpoints get closer or further away. But that's not the real trick hidden in my editing. No, what you hopefully haven't realized is that I am not filming the asides at the same time that I'm filming this. Because this right here is a totally different setup. Remember how my apartment is small? There is no space for me to put the camera right there. So once I'm done with the whole main story and the retakes, I get up, move everything about 4 feet that way, and then do the asides from there. And if you've seen my review of I'm Thinking of Ending Things, you saw me play with this a bit, no longer wearing my glasses in the aside, bringing in and removing the camera in the cuts, and then even switching from night to day and shrugging it off. All of it happens in an instant for you, but not for me. I mean, think about the lighting here. In the past, the lighting in the aside, with this ring light right in front of my face, was largely the same as it is here. But that had to change when I started wearing glasses, because if I actually had the ring light immediately in front of my face, you would see the ring reflected the whole time, and that would be really fucking annoying. So now it's up there, and as long as I don't tilt my head too high up, you won't see it. And like, if I'm hiding all of that here, imagine what's being hidden in a recording of a live performance. What happens between each cut? Are we moving seamlessly from one moment to the next, or is something being obscured? Perhaps a mistake. Hell, is this even the same performance that we're watching now? Or have the best moments of multiple shows been stitched together? Common wisdom says that the best editing is the editing that you don't notice, which means the editing in DelGaudio's in and of itself isn't very good. Though I think the camera work is the real distraction, with focus that doesn't always hit the mark and just way too much movement that feels less intentional than it does like videographers scrambling to get the shot. I have done live event videography and it is hard and stressful, so I empathize with them, but because I could feel their work, it means I was taken away from DelGaudio's. I do have one specific gripe about the editing, though, which is the last negative thing I will say about this, again, 10 out of 10 subject. I don't understand why we see so much of the audience. Like, I get why in a comedy show you want to cut to the audience laughing, especially during the pause after a big line when the comedian is up there on stage not really doing anything. During a concert, you want to show people getting into it and singing along, maybe moshing if things are getting heavy. Even in a traditional magic show, after the big reveal, I get the impulse to show us the shocked faces of the people in the room to remind us that this isn't just camera trickery making the magic look good. It was already pretty gosh damn good. But in and of itself is none of those things. Far too often, DelGaudio's carefully crafted silence is punctuated with random faces from the crowd. And for what? It doesn't matter that people in the audience gasp or whatever at this thing on stage, and seeing it happen reduces the moment to a trick. The exact thing DelGaudio has spent his career working to avoid. I mean, take what seems to be one of his breakout moments from 2011, a very brief performance that would retroactively be called 184 seconds. DelGaudio sat at a table in front of a few decks of cards. He asked someone to time him for 1 minute, and as soon as it starts, he begins doing a second deal, or just second. This is when someone invisibly deals the second card from the deck instead of the first. And I think you can understand why this could be useful for a magician, or perhaps in the world of high-stakes gambling. And he did this 184 times in a row in 60 seconds. And then he got up and left. That was it. A display of extreme technical ability. There was no trick at all. We'd see him do these second deals in and of itself alongside a number of other moves that he makes look effortless, but are also probably impossible, as he tells us a story about cultivating the skills of a wolf while appearing as a dog. And he really does feel like a wounded puppy at times, sad and kind of awkward, definitely uncomfortable, like he's constantly about to cry. At times it verges on melodrama, but never quite gets there. He's always just on the right side of the line, and it is magnetic. Like, he somehow convinces you that he's still figuring it all out in the show that he's done literally hundreds of times and meticulously planned every single moment of. If you had told me that the performance I saw and any of the performances that were on film were at the beginning of the run as the kinks were still being worked out, I'd have believed you. And that's the point. It's disarming. He is disarming. And watching him do these second deals is just so strange because you can't reconcile the fact that the top of the deck isn't moving with the fact that a new card keeps appearing on the table in front of him. Like, it doesn't feel impressive because it's hard to even understand what you're seeing. It is almost a little scary to know that people can do things like that, and that no matter how close you or a camera gets to the action, you will never really see it. And while it was incredible to watch the full 15 minutes of DelGaudio manipulating these cards on stage and then doing that bonkers ending while blindfolded with no cuts that a mistake could even theoretically be hidden with, the film offers a clear benefit in the form of those close-ups that you just can't get in a theater. Yep. Despite my expectations and earlier complaints, Derek DelGaudio's in and of itself convinced me that the show could survive an audiovisual record and even thrive on it. The change in medium does diminish its impact, but it's mostly a matter of changing that impact. And on film, there is the opportunity to expand upon key moments in a genuinely wonderful way. The film is composed of multiple performances, and I expect an entire run or several done with no audience at all, and takes advantage of this by showing us critical sequences play out multiple times from multiple of those 552 shows that he did as the run kept getting extended over and over again. We see, for example, multiple persons yesterday come down and read what they said about the ending, as DelGaudio gets to marvel over how the book has grown, because it's the only time he sees it. He shows us some of his favorite entries, and on film, we get close-ups of pages that I just had to imagine. If you pause, you can actually read the contributions, which is genuinely amazing. If they were to release a replica of it as a coffee table book or something, I would spend like $100 on that, $150, maybe more if they were really hardcore about it. But even better is being able to hear multiple yesterdays do the reading themselves as they tell us what they think will happen. It's okay that they do this so early in the show because obviously everyone is wrong because none of us can fathom what this man is going to do. And so we get to just take in their words as they intended them. And as someone who made the decision to speak these reviews that, given how little accompanying imagery I use, may as well have just been written out, I obviously appreciate hearing words in the writer's own voice. And yeah, someone could have gotten some piece of this by seeing the show multiple times, but there's a very specific effect that you get from seeing the same moment with a new audience back to back that really emphasizes just how meaningful what this show does is. You can sit in and with a single moment and really gain a greater appreciation for how it impacts so many different people. And while it seems obvious that they would have done it this way, obvious does not mean inevitable. And it's not just that. We see bits of home video footage as well as these painted animations at a few key points to help visualize things that we were supposed to imagine. DelGaudio asks Mix yesterday if they saw the elephant, and they didn't. Nor did I in the theater, but we get some version of it on screen. And honestly, I don't think the animations add much, and that elephant in particular is kind of actively distracting, but their inclusion shows that a serious effort was made to turn this into something more than your average performance video, and I appreciate that, in theory, enough to largely outweigh my reservations in practice. Plus, I think it's very fitting that this film would try to recontextualize aspects of the performance when recontextualization as a concept is such a fundamental part of it. The most personal section for DelGaudio is associated with the gold brick shoved through a piece of glass in the bottom left chamber of the wall. At the beginning of the story, it's just a brick. We can assume the glass represents a broken window, but even knowing that, or even why the window was broken, doesn't tell you much. People are bigoted. But that's not the point. The point is how that knowledge and how that brick shaped who Derek DelGaudio was and is and will be. By the end, we understand what the brick is to him, and so can never think of it as just a brick again. And he regrets that he's done that he's made us project all of this onto a rectangular block of sand and clay, and so he releases us from it with a bit of magic that is probably the most straightforward in the entire act, but also completely beautiful. And it reminds me of an illusion that I recently watched again here on YouTube by magician Aussie Wind on an episode of Penn and Teller's show Fool Us. In it, Wind starts by performing a very cool trick. A member of the audience names a totally random card, and Wind pulls out a deck from a box with 51 blank faces and just one real card, the selected one. Wind then shows us how the trick was done, and that is magical too, seeing the inner workings of a complex machine that results in that incredible moment. And throughout the routine, he's telling us about himself, how he came to learn magic, but also how learning magic changed his relationship to it forever. How he lost something the moment he decided to buy his first trick from a magic shop in Israel. And while he accepts that because it was ultimately his choice, he doesn't feel he gets to make that choice for the audience. They came to be amazed and fooled, not to have the magic taken away. And so in the final turn, he frees us from the knowledge behind the illusion and breaks everything we thought we understood about it, just as Derek DelGaudio frees us from the implications of that brick because he doesn't feel it's his place to have given them to us. I love that routine, and I would bet at least $15 that DelGaudio has seen it and loves it too. But while a brick should really just be a brick, DelGaudio wants us to understand that the people there in that room are more than just strangers, or even more than the labels they chose for themselves. What follows is, and I'm not exaggerating, the single most amazing thing I have ever seen in my entire life. And it is never topped. Honestly, that's kind of okay. DelGaudio grabs some cards from the top of the stack, offers them to a member of the audience. That person selects one, reads it, hands it over. What is about to happen to that person whose label was selected is life-changing because DelGaudio grabs a few envelopes from the upper right chamber, calls the person down, and hands them those envelopes. The from addresses are blacked out, but on the back are labels like father, sister, etc. This person is given a free choice of any of the envelopes. They choose one, and DelGaudio tells us what is about to happen because what's about to happen is impossible. And if he doesn't explain it to us, we won't understand, and we hardly do as is. The person on that stage is going to read a handwritten letter from their father or sister or etc. And we will see what happens when they are put in that position. In my show, it was an old man with a ponytail. His son had written him. He opened it, looked at DelGaudio in utter disbelief, and began to cry. This man did not read the letter to us, but he didn't need to. We saw the transition that we were promised, from stranger to person. Derek DelGaudio had pulled off an actual miracle, one he would have to do 552 times. We see several of these miracles on film, each person having the same genuine bewilderment followed by a crashing down of their defenses. And the selected knights included people who did feel comfortable reading the letters to the audience. And so we get that alongside everything else. And Jesus fucking Christ, can you even begin to imagine what that experience must have been like for them? I still think about the time a mentalist who visited my college correctly guessed what I'd written on a whiteboard. It was llamas are cute, by the way, and dude called me out for trying to come up with something super random. And he's not even fucking done. There's still 2 more impossible things he has to do. And I think that means it's finally time to talk about my cards. As I mentioned a while ago, footage of people selecting their I am cards at the beginning of the film plays underneath a voiceover, which includes the line, "Only a lucky few get to play the part they want. The rest settle for what's left or struggle with what they've been handed." And I don't want to get too caught up on the metaphor, but it is worth noting that I wasn't able to get what I wanted, not because someone else had taken it, but because the option was never there in the first place. And until I started working on this, I always assumed that it was because the thing was pretty specific, and even if there are 1,000 cards, there are 100,000 things that people could conceivably want to select. But as I've been thinking about it, I realized that no, it was probably an active decision not to include it because it's a cheat. The point of selecting an I am card is to flatten yourself, to have that singular identity whether you want it or not. The problem is that the thing I readily identify myself as is someone who refuses to be flattened, which I guess really just makes me a pretentious fuckwit. My Twitter profile says aspiring multi-hyphenate, but that first part is really only there to hide my true pretension. That title is reserved for men like DelGaudio or Frank Oz, prominent figures with multiple types of work out there in the public sphere that give them the clout necessary to say that they're more than just a writer or a performer or whatever. They get to be multiple things when the New York Times references them in the story, and I don't get mentioned at all. But I don't care about that, and also don't really need external validation over this. I do a lot of shit, and I think all of it is equally meaningful and equally valid. As I mentioned in the pre-intro, I released a song yesterday. It's called Checking In, and it relates to what we've been talking about here because it centers on the deep conflict I feel about my own place in the world and how I communicate that, or if I even should. The relevant line is, taught to be the protagonist, but I'm clearly off the path. Fought to just be adequate and barely manage that. I exist in a society that privileges people who look like me. And I've been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to make short films and write rap songs and do weird performance art that has just cost me thousands and thousands of dollars with absolutely no financial return, just because I wanted to, needed to. Something I realized about myself years ago is that the only way I feel okay talking about my problems is if I make them interesting for an audience. I can't just do it for me. It has to be a show. And so when I couldn't find multi-hyphenate up there on the board, I decided to go in exactly the opposite direction, select something more abstract, but equally reflective. A bad idea. It sounds like a joke, and people did laugh during the absolute epic that is DelGaudio looking at each member of the audience who wants to be acknowledged for what they chose and saying it straight to their fucking soul. And it bothered me that people thought it was a joke, but what mattered is that he didn't. He didn't smile, he just gave a little nod with the same sad eyes as he said the words, and I sat down. In modern parlance, I was shook because I felt seen. Like, sure, the grammar's a little wonky, but you get it, right? I want to be a multi-hyphenate because it's the only way I can deal with myself. I have to have multiple projects at a time because when one inevitably fails, I need another to fall back on. And of course, they're always sad. One-man shows about the way I failed the women in my life, films about suicide and body dysmorphia, songs that start with me wondering if my medication is still doing its job. Fucking insufferable. But there's a way to make this all work, obviously, because DelGaudio has done it. As he told Stephen Colbert, in and of itself is an existential crisis. It is an attempt to unpack a stranger saying that he is a man who plays Russian roulette with an increasingly full revolver night after night. And we go on this incredible journey that brings this seeming nonsense into total clarity. And it's just perfect. The show is perfect. And it does not matter if the film is not. 10 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hammer and Marco, Kat Zaricata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, Magnolia Denton, Elliot Fowler, Greg Lucina, Liam Knipe, Kojo, Phil Bates, Willow, and I Am the Sword. If you like this video, that's great. If not, I do not fucking care. If you want to see more, please subscribe. There'll probably never be another one quite like this, but, you know, hope to see you in the next one.